we believe very strongly that our programming is intended to develop not just a broader understanding of healthcare policy and how the American healthcare system works, but also a sense of how to successfully drive policy change. We really want to build and support change makers in healthcare policy. And that's the goal. That takes a knowledge base, yes, but it also takes a certain professional skill set to do that throughout your career. And those who do this kind of work throughout their career are likely to find themselves in government at times, working to set or enact policy or oversee agencies that are implementing policies and programs. And they are likely to find themselves outside of government at other times, trying to get agencies or decision makers to take a particular action, to take a particular approach. They tend to have worked or served on both sides of this particular relationship, inside and outside of government. Now, regardless of which side you all happen to be on at a given moment during your careers, you have to work with people or are affected by people and what they do on the other side of it, right? So that's certainly been true in my career. I was fortunate to serve as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Governor Susana Martinez in New Mexico, overseeing half of the state's cabinet agencies, as well as policy and communications and the development of the state budget inside the governor's office. Also worked for the mayor of Albuquerque, which was an interesting experience to be at the local level. Now, for most of my work is on the outside, and has been for several years, overseeing advocacy efforts and programs for one of our state's largest business associations. So that's a little about my background inside and outside of government. And we are pleased to have with us for this panel session, two people who have had a very similar story throughout their career, being inside and outside of government, trying to drive change in both arenas. So first we have Kim Brandt with us. She's a lawyer by trade. And an advocacy strategist and partner at Tarplin, Downs & Young. She started her career inside government, however, working for the Inspector General at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, was a deputy administrator at CMS, and worked in Congress for the Senate Committee on Finance. Kim, welcome. Thank you for being here. We're happy that you were able to come talk to us. Great.
Happy to be here.
Our second panelist is Marie Sanderson, and she's an HRA board member, which we're very happy to have her leadership on our board, and founding partner of Guidepost Strategies. She worked for Governor Haley Barbour as his budget director, director of federal affairs, top policy advisor. Also served as the policy director for the Republican Governors Association. And interestingly, she was responsible for ushering through the successful Senate confirmation of Nikki Haley to the post of United Nations ambassador. Both Kim and Marie are heavily engaged in all kinds of advocacy work in their respective posts now, and have been involved on various healthcare issues throughout their career. Marie, it's good to see you as well. Thanks
Good to see you all. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So we're going to try to cover a lot of ground in a short period of time. So let me just start with this. It seems as though it would be a good thing for there to be a dynamic, symbiotic, healthy relationship and conversation between those inside government and those outside, that the sharing and vetting of ideas and approaches, the communications of interests to those in power, these are very democratic principles that we tend to view, positively. So the starting question for both of you would be, how do good public servants and advocates from the outside work together in a way that produces good policy? So Kim, we'll kick it off with you.
Sure. Well, I think it's a critical part of the process. One of the things that during my almost 20 years in government that really helped me the most was hearing from people on the outside. When you're working on the inside, you know a little, but you don't know a lot. And when you have subject matter experts, people who really know the issues on the outside, their input can be critical to helping you make good policy, because they can educate you and serve as a resource for you to help you to become smart on those issues so that you can ultimately make better better policy. It's a very, as you put it, symbiotic relationship because, they also are great sounding boards as you're developing policy. I would often have sort of an informal kitchen cabinet, if you will, of people that were, experts on whatever issue I was working on, whether it was a super complicated Medicare payment issue or something as simple as, well, not that it's ever simple, but you were just talking fraud and abuse, and I did a lot of fraud and abuse legislation. And so, we'd look for people who are experts on that, and I might slip them draft language or say, hey, here are the things that we're thinking about. Do you think this would work in practicality? Because the worst thing you can do as a policymaker is come up with a policy that then can't be operationalized. You want to make sure that it's workable on the outside, whether within the agency that you're working for on behalf of, if you're on the Hill, or if you're in the agency, to make sure that the providers or the people that are going to be impacted by it can actually live under it and be able to do what they need to.
Marie, anything to add there?
I would say it's incredibly important. My early years on the Hill, and I think particularly of the Hill, I think Kim, before she left, was probably one of the most well-respected and experts on these issues. And even she reached out for help. But, there's a lot of young talent on the Hill, and there's a lot of discussion about lobbyists and can't talk to other people. And I think the reality is that's just not, you're missing a lot of rich context if you don't allow yourself to talk to professionals who have been in your shoes before you. And if I am much smarter now than I was when I was 25, when I was working on some of these issues. And so, I think that code of conduct is really important. I did have an open door policy when I was a staffer and allowed people in, but I also kept that radar up because you have to protect your boss. And Kim probably only gave that language to people she knew would give her feedback, and the information would stop there. And so I think that code of conduct is really important. I'm sure you'll get into this, but they're all different ways. There's think tanks. There are states. I was telling someone earlier, I used to liaison with Kim when I represented the states. Because we felt like we had a point of view on waste, fraud, and abuse, and Obamacare and other things. And so you've got all sorts of spheres of outside influence to the Hill and agencies that run these programs. And it all operates in this big kind of code of conduct if we do our job right.
And I think that is critical. I mean, who you can trust, to Marie's point, I wasn't sharing it with anybody and everybody who came in. It was sort of with the people who were really trusted. But the fact is, they can really give you valuable input that you might not be able to have just on your own. Right.
So it sounds as though what is most beneficial from outside groups is information that is reliable, dependable, real world. Right, you mentioned testing something, the feasibility of something, so it's legitimate feedback. So, in the best sense of it, this particular relationship works well when those in government have individuals and organizations they can trust on the outside to provide them with information that they perhaps might not have. So, a question might be, why? It's the government, right? Federal government in some cases that for example, Kim, that you've worked in, why doesn't the government have all of this information, the data, policy approaches, and proposals? What is it about the work experience of those in government that prevents them from having at their fingertips all of the information that they are needing to get from those on the outside?
Well, in some cases, it's because it's the government and it's bureaucracy, and it's just very difficult to get everyone to share information and to have all the information readily available in one place. When I first started doing fraud and abuse work, which was in the early 2000s, when I went over to CMS, one of the biggest challenges we had there was that there was no integrated data repository that gave me all the information for all the Medicare claims. There were over 50 separate repositories. So I could not tell if there was fraud, waste, substance abuse going on unless we actually mined across 50 different repositories. Sometimes states and state Medicare fraud control units, per the conversation you just had, would often have a better idea of what was happening than the federal government did because we weren't able to see comprehensively across the board. Thankfully, almost 20 years later, that's now not the case. They do have much better data, but in a lot of instances, the data that they have is not going to be as specific to a disease category or a patient category or some of those things as individual organizations who are really tracking that because of their specific interests. And that's where it can be super helpful to the government. Part of it is, again, though, within government, it's getting everybody to talk to each other and making sure that there is actually infrastructure available for the data to flow so that you can have everything accessible in one place.
Marie, similar thoughts from a state government perspective?
State government definitely lacks resources, and in many cases the technology. And then I think at the end of the day, it's still a human being who's trying to evaluate that data. And the United States is built on capitalism. We have private sector companies that learn how to do things faster and better, and benefiting from that information is really helpful. And I think that's kind of a philosophical. I think a lot of times you see Republicans lean on or are more accepting of private sector ideas sometimes than Democrats, or maybe left leaning. Maybe I shouldn't use a party name. But you see that a lot, and state government is made better in particular when they have the benefit of experts, not only in the private sector, but across state lines. What did this other state do? That water cooler conversation, benefiting from each other, but also benefiting from what the federal government's done as well.
Yeah, I know back during my service with the state in the governor's office, I know we did rely on the RGA as a resource for exactly that. We knew there was no way we were the only people facing a certain problem, and so we relied on the RGA for that. But it could come from anywhere, that kind of information. Just as an anecdote, we only had about 30 people in the governor's office in New Mexico, handling a $6 billion budget and 23 agencies, et cetera. That's not a lot of capacity, and there's a lot of capacity outside the walls that if you structure the conversations right with the proper ethical code, et cetera, that can be very, very helpful. So let me ask, what should an organization not do that is trying to influence change, provide information, et cetera? Have you run into instances where they just really messed it up and they were not helpful? What are some things that are mistakes that advocates on the outside can make?
Going negative too early. Mm-hmm. I mean, honestly, I think if you're a policymaker and you represent a think tank, or you represent a state, or you represent even a company, there's a right and a wrong way. Actually, there's not. Let me reframe this. There's two types of advocacy. There's positive and there's negative, and both of them are very useful tactics. But if you're trying to get something done, engaging the staff and trying to be helpful, and being a resource is ideal, right? And I always recommend people start there. When you have to go negative on advocacy, it's because you're having to pressure a decision maker who has already made the decision not to go with your decision, and try and move them. And you do that in lots of different ways. We don't have time on this call to get into all the various ways you run a public affairs campaign. But I think it's always best to start trying engaging in a favorable way if you can before you do anything negative.
And I would concur with that. I think the other thing is always come in with, if you've defined what a problem is or what a policy issue is that you want to have, come with some idea or some suggestions for how it is that you could potentially get there, and make sure that the data and information that you have that you're giving to the policymaker about that is reliable and accurate. One of the biggest things that I've seen, particularly in my time at CMS, especially when I was doing opioid and substance abuse issues, was people people coming in with stuff that hadn't been peer reviewed, that was not, completely fact checked and stuff, might be persuasive in and of itself. But if you would look at it in the context of the larger picture, it wasn't something that I could make a policy decision off of, because it was one small snippet that didn't tell the whole story. And oftentimes at CMS in particular, one of the biggest things I saw was that people would come in and say, well, this is terrible and you need to fix it, but then had no suggestions for how it was that we could fix it. And again, as a policymaker, you want to try and be helpful. Your job as a government person is to work with the public to try and find solutions. It's really difficult to do that if you aren't even being presented with a couple of options to start with. I mean, we're creative people, but going to your point about limited staff, Scott, I mean, at any given point in time, CMS has a lot of people, but they're chronically understaffed overall, given the amount of work that they have to do. And same on the Hill. So the more that you can come and be prepared with, hey, we know there's a problem. Here's a couple of thoughts we had about how you might want to think about solving it. And here's some really good, reliable data that shows why this is a problem. Then that goes a long way.
Great. So we've identified 3 things there in those responses. So bad information, right? Or unreliable information, unusable information, right? And number 1. Number 2, raising a problem with no solution, right? Just railing against the.
That's a good one.
Yeah, that's an issue. And then the third one is going negative too early. And let's spend a little more time on that, because there are 2 sides to how advocates on the outside can try to get their way. They have no formal levers of power to pull, right? So they have to get people who do to make the decision they want. So there's positive pressure or negative pressure. So on that question of going negative too early, that's got to be a really difficult call as to at what moment do you switch from trying to encourage them and provide them information to make the right decision to it's not working. And now we have to put so much external pressure on them to get them to make a decision that they otherwise wouldn't in the absence of that negative pressure. So, that would be one question, is how do you find that right time frame? And then I think just a bigger question is, what are forms of negative pressure? What are tools of negative pressure that work? I mean, I'm sure on one extreme, it's a full-blown campaign of some sort, right? With a PAC and people contributing, and you run a campaign of some sort against somebody, right? But what's the array of negative pressure tools? So Marie, your thoughts on either of those?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look, you can write a letter to the editor. You can do a tweet. I mean, we live in the world of social media. A harmful tweet or a paid media digital content that a lot of the stakeholders see. I think it's a little bit of like the forest through the tree, like seeing the forest through the trees. As an advisor to a lot of groups, my biggest frustration, particularly on the center right, is these purity tests where you see a lot of governors in like a moderate state doing as much as they can, and then this hasn't happened as much late, but it happened a whole lot in the 2010-ish type years, the early 2020 to early 2000s, where a governor didn't go far enough. And so this litmus test, this purity test of they were beat up for not going far enough, rather than seeing the forest through the trees. They're doing as much as they can in Vermont. They're doing as much as they can in a state like New Mexico, Scott, where you're from. So I think I advise people to make sure that if you go negative, that you're not inching towards your goal, because once you go negative, it does change the dynamics of the conversation. And you're right, there are multiple ways you do that. If you don't have a large budget, again, social media, a letter to the editor, but fundraising, clearly. But there are lots of, the public affairs industry is extremely sophisticated now, and there's a lot of ways to go negative on an issue or an elected official, whatever it may be, to get your message known.
Kim, any thoughts on that? Negative pressure?
I think Marie stated it really well. I mean, again, you have to, it's a very delicate balance, because depending on when you go negative and how negative you go, that can perhaps force their hand to force them to do what you want, but it can also forestall any ability you have to work collaboratively to get it done. So you just kind of have to make sure that you are timing your moment, I guess would be the best way to put it, if you're going to go negative.
Yeah, and another challenge there is what if the issue is super arcane, right? It's hard to go. I mean, if it's a super salient issue, well, then you can send out patch through phone calls to the legislator's district, right? And all of a sudden now, because it's a salient issue, people care about it. They're actually, hitting the number that takes them through to the switchboard at the Capitol, right? If it's an arcane issue, it's kind of hard to. What does negative pressure look like, Kim, when you're talking about a narrow healthcare regulation, right? Or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what they tend to do on the negative side, if they want to try and push something, is to find, what beneficiaries or what patients are impacted, and really try the patient angle, particularly from a healthcare perspective on the Hill. It's sort of, try and make it. I'll give an example. This isn't arcane per se, but it's somewhat timely. There has been this shift in a CMMI model called direct contracting, and they shifted from one type of model that had been set up under the Trump administration to a slightly different variation of it under now the Biden administration. Basically same key concepts, they just renamed it and stuff. But the big reason for that was there was this big brouhaha that was ginned up by over 50 members of the Progressive Caucus in Congress and a bunch of outside people to say that this was hurting Medicare beneficiaries and it was denying them of their choice to participate in these models, and that this was a thing that was going to have a negative impact on Medicare beneficiaries. What this was, it was a sort of thinly veiled attack on Medicare Advantage generally, which is a whole other thing. But the fact is, in this particular instance, the negativity about this sort of did manage to get the Biden administration to at least change the name and make a few changes to that program. But it was something where it wasn't really the program itself. It was sort of the overall issues and sort of approach of the program that the people didn't like. And they used the perceived harm to Medicare beneficiaries as that sort of tipping point. So to me, that's an example of where it, ended up becoming kind of a negative thing of, well, this is going to be terrible. And it didn't actually get to the real issue at hand, but they were able to use the negativity to really, and the average consumer has no idea what the direct contracting program is, has no clue how these models work. Mm-hmm. But that's an example of where some people were able to get the right buzzwords and the right language to get a bunch of people to care about it that otherwise would not have. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's a recent one I can point to.
Yeah. Would you all say that a good advocate tends to be a generalist in the sense that they are comfortable, Marie, you mentioned, with letters to the editor or op-eds, right? They can write about policy and communicate in a way that the general public might be able to digest and understand it, right? But the next week, they might have to actually meet with an agency head and try to persuade them on a particular policy matter, which means they have to be able to write at a technical level to some extent anyway, get down in the weeds on a particular policy item, might have to draft bill language. At some point, they might actually have to stand up and be in front of a television camera or a radio program or do a newspaper interview. And then if they have to go negative, perhaps they have to be comfortable with putting together digital television advertising or these sorts of things. It paints the picture of people who are sort of agile operators. Is that a fair description of many of the people that you've worked with throughout your career who do the things that you've done, both inside and outside of government?
I would say no. I mean, look, I would say Kim and I have complementary skill sets. I know a lot about healthcare. She knows a whole lot about healthcare. I could probably run a pressure campaign in my sleep, but she could draft the bill language, right? So I think in many cases, you see a lot of situations where like a Marie and a Kim team up. I do think that you have, there are people who, most people in politics, and I mentor a lot of people. My firms have interns programs, but where you kind of have to pick when you get to Washington. Do you want to do policy? Do you want to do politics? Do you want to do fundraising? And then there are all these places that you can go. And the menu's bigger than that now, between, like you said, mail and digital and phones, and you learn how to do all that. There's a very rare person that's done both, where you've done the Hill or governor's office and politics. I've done a little bit of it all because I got into it at RGA when I went there to do policy, but I wouldn't call myself the person that is the operative. My business partner is. He's the one that runs all the campaigns. So in short, I don't think the people watching have to be everything to everybody, but don't walk into a meeting and pretend to be who you're not, right? If you've gotten as far as you can to the staff are saying, I'll take a meeting with you, then find the right person to go with you to make it worth your while. Don't waste their time. So in the same token, if you've hit a wall and you've got to do advocacy and you've got to run a pressure campaign and you have no idea how to do it, find someone who does. And that's what makes people good at what they do, is when they're self-aware about what they can and they can't do.
Okay. And Kim, I'll get your thoughts on it, but let me just say to everybody, if you've got a question, be sure to put it in the chat and we'll definitely get to those. So Kim, your thoughts on that, about the skill set of a good advocate?
I agree with Marie. I think that, I have always operated best when surrounded by people with complementary skill sets and even similar skill sets, depending on, how it goes. Because the fact is, you need to have people with the deep knowledge of the policies to be able to, Marie's point, to have it so that when you go and have the conversation on the Hill, the fact is, sometimes the Hill staffers you're meeting with have a deep knowledge, sometimes they don't. So sometimes they're looking to you to help them learn about this. So you want to make sure and take somebody who's going to be able to go and be that person for them, especially, some offices have relatively new or young staff who just don't know the issues yet. And Maria was talking about how she mentors interns and others at her firm. I have a whole cadre of people in Capitol Hill who I have coffee with or lunch with on a regular basis because I'm helping teach them about fraud and abuse, or I'm, teaching them a little bit about Medicare policy, because they just, they're not as in the weeds on it. And I had people that did that for me when I was early on in the game. But I do think, Marie's point about know what you know, but also be aware of what you don't know is really good. And make sure that you form a team that has all the right skill sets on it. Because I think, I always tell people that my knowledge is, about 3 inches deep, but 30,000 inches wide. But the fact is, on some things, it's a lot deeper. And where I don't have it, I surround myself with people who do, because I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on something like drug policy when that's just not something that I'm in the weeds on.
Right. So let's talk a little more. I mean, we've talked a lot about advocacy from the outside. Let's talk a little more about in government service. Many people do enter government, especially political appointees, thinking that maybe making a difference or driving a change will be quick and an easy process, that all the people they encounter in government, that they will be sort of naturally and easily on board, right? Helping to drive change in the same direction. Probably a little bit naive about the number of people they will have to fight along the way, right, in order to get something done. How does somebody who becomes a first-time political appointee, how do they skillfully navigate from the inside and get government to move in the right direction? And we'll start on that with you, Marie, but when it gets to you, Kim, I know you served in a civil servant capacity and as an appointee, so you've seen sort of the careerist experience, as well as the sort of you're on the executives team side of things. So anyway, that's the question on the table, Marie. How does a person who's been appointed to a post in government skillfully navigate from the inside to move policy?
Well, I'm going to say some basic stuff, and then I want to hear from Kim, because since she's actually done the roles. I mean, I think the first is just be a good human being. if you're head of legislative affairs for the White House and you're dealing with members on the other side of the aisle, you just be respectful of the members, get the staff the information you can within reason, and just be a good person. I mean, we all know operators who are on the other side of the aisle, or maybe within the same party, but have different viewpoints on things. And you can agree to disagree in a respectful way. And in some ways, we have another podcast or another conversation on this. Like some of that has left politics, which is unfortunate. I had the benefit of watching when it did exist, because I'm that old. So, but the other thing I would say is have thick skin. I mean, politics is politics. You can be a decent person and a good operator, but also recognize that the person you just had a really nice conversation with might send a letter completely outing your boss the minute you leave the office. There are a lot of people who are friends, and I think I'm going to make a bit of a statement for some of the women out there. I find that the men in my business do this really well. They have drinks with someone, and the next day, one of the guys knifes them in the back, with a political candidate, and we're like, what was that? And he's like, well, I know he's my friend, but we're at war when it comes to politics. And I think women don't do as well with that. But I think if you're going into politics, you just need to be prepared to know that it is a situation where you're always going to have an enemy. There's no kumbaya moment in politics. But you can get along, you can treat others with respect, and you can leave your post with others who are on other sides of the issue, being your friends, being your allies when you go to the private sector, because at the end of the day, they want to work with you because they know they're the type of person that can work through any issue. But Kim, you actually did it.
Well, and actually, I think that is spot on. That's what I was going to say. In fact, one of the big things that I'm most proud of is I've survived 20 years in this town. And, for the most part, people on both sides of the aisle still like me and still talk to me. So that's, no small thing right there. And I think a large part of that is, be an honest broker, be a good person, be true. I think the differences between being a careerist and a political are somewhat unique. So when I was a career person, both at the HHS OIG and then particularly at CMS, where I was a career person who was acting in sort of a pseudo political type of position because I was heading up all the fraud and abuse work at CMS. I think the key there really was, that your job as a career executive is to follow the lead of the political team. I mean, your job is to do what they ask you to do. They have a mission to do, and unless it's immoral or unethical or illegal, your job is to do it and to find a way to do it. However, your job is also to make them aware of what the pitfalls are, and to make sure that they're well educated, because sometimes their philosophical or political bent on a particular issue might not allow them to know some of the things that you as a career person might know, having looked at the issue from multiple sides. So a big part of your job as a career person is you can have your own very strong political views, and I certainly did during certain parts of certain administrations, but I always tried to stick to the fact that those are my personal views. That's not part of my job. My job is to make sure that the person I'm working for knows all the knowledge they need to know to do their job well. And then similarly, when I switched over and was a political at CMS for nearly the entire Trump administration at CMS, it helped that I had the credibility from having been a career person who acted with honor and integrity, because the career people at CMS were much more willing to take a leap on some of the political things we were asking them to do, because they trusted in my judgment to get done. But it's because I also involved them. One of the things that I think is really key for the politicals, and it goes to sort of treating people well, like Marie talked about, is you as a political need to acknowledge that the career people are essential to you getting your mission accomplished. You cannot push your agenda. You cannot get it done unless those career people are on your team. And so showing that you care about their views, that you're willing to listen to their dissenting views, and then at least, saying to them, okay, I hear what you say, but we're still going to do it this way, but appreciate you raising that. That goes a long way. Instead of, I have seen it, and I've seen it having worked for 4 different administrations, where sometimes the politicals come in and are like, we don't care what you think, we're just going to do it anyway. And it's a lot harder for the careers to get on board and actually operationalize and do what they want to do if they feel like they haven't been allowed any voice in the conversation. So I think it's, to get it done, you really, you need to lead by example. You need to show that you're a big enough person to listen to dissenting viewpoints. But at the end of the day, you have a job that you need to do. The president's telling you what to do. The secretary is telling you what to do. You need to get it done, and just let them know that you've heard their views, but now we're all on the same team. And our goal is we got to get it done because this is what we're being told to do. And ultimately, I found I could get folks to do things that they might not have wanted to do just by, showing them that we were a team. It wasn't an us versus them sort of thing. We were all in the same ship, so to speak.
And that's such great advice from both of you on this front. I know in New Mexico, there are 22,000 state employees. 400 of them were political appointees.
Yeah.
That means that everyone else is implementing the decisions that get made, and they have the career bureaucracy has many ways in which, if you provoke it to, it can fight against what you'd like to see done.
And they will do so in a not obvious but very strong way, because they can slow walk things, they can make it tougher to implement, and again, not intentionally, but if they feel like they're put in a position where it's not something that they feel comfortable with, they will not be as effective in working with you.
Yeah, great. Just one last thing on political appointees. So I've given a presentation several times that essentially sums up in my experience what the key characteristics or features were of an ethical and effective political appointee to a decision maker. And it's called You're Hitched is the presentation. Hitch is the acronym: be humble, be informed, be thick-skinned. So there you go, Marie.
That's good. Yeah.
I love it.
Concise and be helpful, right?
Yeah, still that.
So it's just on the humility front, as a political appointee, you do have to remember, correct, that you were not elected to anything, right? That your existence there is to help achieve the aims, the goals, the objectives that your principal was elected to pursue. And even on the thick-skinned front, that actually helps with that, right? Because if I wasn't elected to anything and I'm taking arrows, or getting attacked, they're not coming after me. They're coming after my boss, right? And at least a little bit offers some perspective, doesn't it, in the environment that we're in right now, where things are just as nasty as ever.
Yeah, it's a great acronym. Really, I'm going to steal that. I love it. So
great. Have at it. Ethical boundaries. It was mentioned at the start. I want to make sure we don't get out of this conversation without covering it a little bit more in depth. What are the appropriate, some anyway, you can't cover all of them, but what are some of the appropriate ethical boundaries that people should be mindful of when they are on either side of this relationship? Those in government, those outside. What should they be very careful of as they go through their work?
Well, I'll start just from the government perspective. I think one of the most important, and this is especially true given some of the roles that I've had, including my most recent one at CMS, is you need to be very mindful about, what kind of information you share and how much information you share, particularly if it's market moving. I've seen people get in trouble as political appointees who, they thought they were being helpful to friends or, to people they had been working with, and ended up giving information that, not intentionally, but unintentionally landed them in the Wall Street Journal or other things as being the subject of investigation for allegedly giving information that sort of, and that's both from the policy side and at the CMS side. So I think from an ethics perspective, just, be aware that you want to be helpful, but not too helpful, and always really think about the breadth and depth of what you're sharing, because anything that could help people know which way a political decision is going to go that could have an impact on stock prices or the market as a whole, it's a really big deal.
Okay. Marie, any thoughts?
I would just reiterate that as a consultant, I require our team to go through a CC training. So they know that they don't put a staffer in that position. And while we're not, state or federal government employees, I think it's just important guidebook to understand. But on the private sector side, I always try and tell people, I don't lobby, but I do a ton of consulting, and that's extracting, and it is a little nuanced in that I'm trying to understand information, but I'm not pushing an idea. We do have people on our team that advocate, but irrespective of what bucket you fall in, telling a staffer who you're representing, I think is pretty important. And if you can't tell them, hey, I'm calling to ask you a couple of questions, and I can't tell you who they are for this reason, give the person on the phone the ability to refuse to give you information. So because it's always important for them to know who you're asking information on behalf of. And I think same thing on the think tank side, just always being, upfront with why you're asking the information, who you plan to give the information to, how it will be used. And if not at all, that still say that. It's like talking to a reporter, those of you who do press, we say this is on background, or, this is not on background. You can do this for the record, or, set up I always like to just set the rules up for the staffer, because it's very clear, even people who are my friends, so they know exactly which box they're answering the question in.
Okay, so we have time for about one more question. I'll throw it out there. I don't know how it will land, but here's the question. Given your experience, your many years of experience, have lobbyists earned their reputation? Or generally speaking, do you believe that the role of a lobbyist is underappreciated, misunderstood?
I think a few bad actors have given a bad reputation. I'll go back. I mean, again, the lobbyists are the ones in the town who, in many cases, have the most information. And if they have that, if they set if they're good lobbyists and they're gonna approach a staffer the way Kim and I just discussed, like, this is why I'm coming to talk to you. But in many cases, the lobbyists are a Kim Brandt, who worked on the Hill, who worked at an agency, who've seen a ton, and now and shocker, but when you leave government, you go to the private sector and you hear about how all these things impact the private sector, it adds another layer of expertise to you. Mm-hmm. The way I see the world now in the private sector, after doing both state and federal work, I've never worked in a White House or agency, but state and federal. And I'm like, oh, wow, if I go back in, I'm going to be even better at what I did. Right. Yeah. And so I think that lobbyists bring that information in. Do they advocate? Absolutely. That's what they're paid to do. But I think as long as we set the rules for engagement, it's done above board. And candidly, I would much rather have a lobbyist have a positive conversation and influence in a good way through information, a staffer, than a CEO or someone who has no idea even how to begin the conversation.
Okay. Kim?
Well, as a seasoned 2-year lobbyist now, or almost 2 years, I would agree with Marie. I think, to be honest, I had some trepidation about, did I really want to do lobbying or not? I wasn't entirely clear. I'm lucky in that I'm at a great firm with terrific people who I knew their reputations, and I knew I was going to be working on quality issues with quality clients. But it really is something, to Marie's point, where I think about, gosh, if I'm lucky enough to go back for one last turn in government at some point, what I've learned and the information that I've gotten knowing about the business of healthcare and really understanding some of the impacts of the policies. I felt like I tried to understand that and appreciate that when I was in government. It's a whole other thing when you're actually working with the clients and delving deep into their business models and really understanding, the different levers that they're dealing with. It really, a good lobbyist, to Marie's point, is going to be able to bring all those perspectives together and really be able to use that to be able to educate and advocate. And that's really, I think, a valuable tool. And that's not something just a CEO can do or just somebody else. You really need somebody who can really know how to pull all the pieces together and help think through that to be able to be effective.
Wonderful. Very well said. Thank you to both of you. We really appreciate the fact that you've spent so much time with us today and offered your expertise to those participating in the program today. Thank you. Wonderful conversation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
We appreciate y'all. Thanks for all you do.